Again, good morning, everyone. I'm Sandra Smith.
And I'm Rick Leventhal in for Bill Hemmer. The president will be heading down to Texas and Ohio tomorrow to join those two communities in mourning right now. But 2020 Democrats refusing to back down from their attack, saying the president has not done enough on gun control, suggesting his rhetoric is to blame.
Kellyanne Conway firing back, saying whatever the president does, it will never be enough for Democrats.
People are allowing nonstop punditry by at least two of the Democratic presidential hopefuls. Beta of work from the Vanity Fair magazine cover to the Vanity Project candidacy out there screaming and cursing about President Trump. That doesn't heal a single soul. That doesn't help prevent another mass shooting. They're raising their profile. And Elizabeth Warren yesterday was raising money for Senate candidates Doug Jones and Tina Smith. She's raising money in an email appeal talking about the mass shooting. This is a disgrace, and if nobody else is going to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it. They all blamed him, and I want to name and shame them now because he did not respond in kind. They want to be president. He is the president, and he's trying to bring the country together.
Rich Edson is live at the White House where the administration is battling back against critics. Rich?
Hey, good morning, Rick. And the White House wants Congress to return. Democrats say Republicans should work with them on gun control legislation that's already passed the House. Earlier this week, the president promised to give law enforcement whatever they needed to address domestic terrorism. He also tweeted that Congress should pass strong background checks and then suggested they marry that with any gun legislation and immigration reform. The White House criticized Democrats and said Congress should scrap at least some of its summer break.
We can't get our advice from people screaming on TV. Those who are elected to do their jobs here in Washington really should either return to Congress or come here to the White House to speak to the president. Around here, where the president works constantly, we wonder why they leave for 6 weeks in the first place. But their constituents can ask them that question.
Congressional Democrats are throwing this one back at the Republican-controlled Senate, urging Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to bring up a bill the House passed in February to expand background checks. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer say, quote, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell has called himself the Grim Reaper and refuses to act on this bipartisan legislation. It is incumbent upon the Senate to come back into session to pass this legislation immediately. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he's directed Senate committees to reflect on the subjects the president has raised, to work on solutions without infringing on Americans' constitutional rights. The White House says President Trump will travel to El Paso and Dayton tomorrow. For now, it seems to be a quiet day at the White House. There are no public events on the president's schedule. Rick?
Rich Edson, thanks very much.
Over in Ohio, we are awaiting a news conference from the governor at this hour. He is expected to unveil new proposals to deal with gun violence in his state and mental health as we learn more about the massacre in Dayton. Police say the gunman fired at least 41 rounds in 30 seconds before officers were able to kill him. Let's bring in Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost. He joins us now. We're happy that you were able to join us on the program this morning. What, first of all, can you tell us to expect as far as any changes to the gun laws in your state following this shooting?
Well, the governor, as you mentioned, is going to outline his ideas this hour, and so we'll all be watching to see what he wants to put on the table.
So as soon as we have those and as soon as we hear what it is that he is proposing, we'll bring that to our viewers. Meanwhile, what can you tell us is the latest on the investigation? What are we learning today about the shooter and what went down outside that bar?
Well, we've entered the shoe leather phase of this investigation. There's a lot of routine police work about reassembling the life and the events leading up to this horrific event. And a key question that remains to be solved is, did the shooter intend to kill his own sister? Does it have something to do with his mental state or his motivation? Today, my people are in Dayton for the next 12 hours at the convention center to work with the families of the victims of this tragedy. We have a variety of services and can help fund some of the expenses and losses that occur after a crime. And we're going to be on the ground reaching out to help those grieving folks.
We, as a country, continue to mourn and grieve with those that lost their loved ones, their friends, their family members on that day. When it comes to the killer, you mentioned his sister, because we know that she is among the victims that day. He shot and killed her. We have seen pictures of them together. We don't know exactly what their relationship was. Has the investigation turned up anything on that?
We are all waiting to hear what comes up out of the next few days of police shoe leather.
As far as the shooters, this kill list, this rape list that he apparently had while he was still in school, what more can you tell us? Who was this person?
Well, he was actually suspended for that hit list. A lot of people are asking questions about whether these should have been red flags. It's sometime in the past, and the police chief there in Dayton has questioned how close the nexus is. But these are all questions that need to be asked, need to be investigated, and really raise the importance of people reacting appropriately when they see this kind of behavior. Very disturbing sort of thing.
And as far as this Twitter feed that is apparently an account that was held by the shooter, belonged to him, holding very extreme views on socialism, anti-police messages, support for Antifa. And what more can you tell us about how he existed in a social media atmosphere and the red flags that were there?
Well, I will defer to the investigators to release their information as it's appropriate. All I can say is the social media trail is troubling, and it's certainly something that we ought to all be watching.
As far as the gun laws in your state, sir, there's no limit for handgun magazine capacity, no mandatory waiting period for a handgun purchase. High-capacity guns, additional magazines were found. A high-capacity gun, I should say, was found with the killer, as well as additional magazines. I mean, we know he had the capacity for multiple hundreds of rounds. Based on everything that we saw there, and we spoke to the mayor of Dayton yesterday, who said it's hard to believe that a civilian could have these type of weapons in his possession. Do you, sir, see the need for changes to your state's gun laws?
You know, the legislature is the one that passes those gun laws. I'm the one that helps to enforce them. I don't have any suggestions at this moment that I want to see them take up. There's a number of things that we're researching, particularly about the cross-checking that can happen or may not happen between disqualifying lists and, for example, CCL permits.
Well, those permits are issued at the county level, though, correct?
That is correct, by the local sheriff.
And right now, the only check is whether or not the person is 21 years old or older or has a criminal past. Final thoughts. The president plans to travel to both Texas and Ohio. How will the president be received there? What would you like to hear from him?
Well, I think that the state, the country is looking for him to bring us together. He is known for the art of the deal. This seems like an appropriate time for him to use those skills to try to create a consensus.
Okay. Dave Yost, the Ohio Attorney General, we appreciate your time this morning, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, police and hospital staff in El Paso confirming 2 more victims have died there, bringing the death toll in Texas to 22. As we learn more about where the suspect obtained his weapon and how he wound up at that Walmart in the first place.
It was bought in near his hometown in Allen, Texas. I don't have the exact details of that right now. The weapon was purchased legally. He took about 10 to 11 hours traveling from Allen, Texas to El Paso. As soon as he got here, after that, he found his way to the Walmart because we understand he was hungry, and that's about as far as I can go without getting into too much detail.
He was hungry. Jeff Paul live in El Paso with the latest. Jeff?
Yeah, Rick, the memorial here outside the Walmart where this shooting happened continues to grow. More and more people are showing up here not only to try to come to terms with what happened, but also to attempt to honor the 22 lives who were taken. One of those people who was murdered in this attack, 15-year-old Amir Rodriguez. Crowds of people coming together last night to remember the teen who was a sophomore in high school and a soccer player. His family says he was shopping for groceries and other items with his uncle when the shot started on Saturday. His uncle was shot, but Rodriguez was killed.
In a time like this, I can't help but feel angry that this young man was robbed of his potential, robbed of his future, and robbed of his life because of someone's unfounded hatred. However, I know that if I truly want to pay tribute to Javier's life, anger has no place in honoring his memory.
This is just one of the many stories we are starting to hear as we learn more and more about the lives of the 22 who were killed. This community is also preparing for a visit from President Trump tomorrow. There is some concern from locals here in El Paso about that, and some politicians like Texas Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, who represents the area, has said Trump is not welcome. Well, the mayor here in El Paso recently addressed the president's visit.
I want to clarify for the political spin that this is the office of the mayor of El Paso in an official capacity welcoming the office of the President of the United States, which I consider is my formal duty.
And while that memorial here continues to grow, the investigation is ongoing. This Walmart remains very much closed. Rick?
Jeff Paul in El Paso. Jeff, thanks very much.
Fox News alert here after the Dow saw its biggest loss of the year yesterday over fears of an escalating trade war with China. Markets are set to rebound today. We look at futures for that. Just an update on what you saw perhaps at the top of this show. There was a bug in the corner of our screen that typically shows Dow futures and where things might open up at 9:30 Eastern time when the opening bell rings on Wall Street. It looked like a drop of over 900 points. That was an incorrect graphic. We are working on that. The Dow right now is on pace to rise more than 200 points on the opening bell on Wall Street. A few minutes from now, Maria Bartiromo from the Fox Business Network will join us live when that happens here in America's Newsroom. So stay tuned for that.
So, bad bug. It was a bad bug. New outrage from opponents after President Trump's statements on the mass shootings in Dayton and El Paso. The president denouncing racism and hate in his address to the nation. But now the New York Times is taking heat for its front page. Why this headline, Trump urges unity versus racism, was heavily criticized and then changed.
Plus, jaw-dropping video of an SUV going airborne. Whoa, after drifting into
makers. Texas Congressman Kenny Marchant's retirement announcement brings the total number of House Republicans leaving office in 2020 to 11. Of that group, 4 of them are from Texas. Joining us now is Hugo Gordon, editor-in-chief for the Washington Examiner. Hugo, thanks for rushing in here for us. Why so many Republicans leaving office, and why so many from the Lone Star State?
Well, it's a very bad sign for the Republicans. Generally, Congress members will retire when they don't think they're going to win. And so those guys, those members are looking at their situation in Texas, in their particular districts, and saying, you know what, I'd rather go out voluntarily retiring than get beaten by a Democrat.
Is it that they're worried they won't win, or that they don't like being in the minority in the House?
Certainly they don't like being in the minority, and it's a combination of those two things. Texas has been trending purple. There's been a great worry for the Republicans that it's getting a little bit more Democrat, or perhaps rapidly getting more Democrat. The chances of the Republicans retaking the House, I think, now are getting slimmer and slimmer. And, you know, they would much rather be in power. But if they're not going to be in power, they don't want to even be in Congress.
It's tougher to keep a seat red or blue if an incumbent isn't running.
Right. Oh, absolutely. But it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If the incumbent gets out of the district, then it makes it far easier for the Democrats to take it. Even if they might actually have lost it by a slim margin, if the Republicans have retained it by a slim margin, it actually changes the equation and makes things better for the Democrats.
And how does this affect the presidential hopes for a re-election in 2020?
It affects it a lot. And the first thing is that this is actually a sign that things are bad in Texas for Trump. Now, I don't think that Texas will go blue in the 2020 presidential presidential election. But clearly the departure of Republicans suggests that that's the way the state is trending.
That would be pretty remarkable if it did. Shootings, of course, are always politicized. We want to switch topics and talk about what happened in Texas and Ohio, and also what happened this morning with the New York Times, which posted a headline on Twitter that it later changed for the print edition. The original headline read, "Trump urges unity versus racism," after his remarks yesterday. The updated headline said, "Assailing hate, but not guns."
Right.
Why did they change the headline?
Well, they came under immediate pressure from the left, and specifically from various Democratic presidential candidates.
And that pressure forced them to change the headline,
well,
you think?
I don't know whether it did. I suspect that it weighed pretty heavily. It was an extraordinary thing because their original headline was a simple, straightforward quotation or news representation of what the president actually said. And then suddenly Beto O'Rourke and Cory Booker were saying it was a disgrace.
Let's read some of those headlines. Christian Gillibrand tweeted, "That's not what happened." And then Cory Booker tweeted, "Lives literally depend on you doing better. New York Times, please do." And AOC tweeted, "Let this front page serve as a reminder of how white supremacy is aided by and often relies upon the cowardice of mainstream institutions."
Yeah, it's remarkable to see the Democrats attacking the media. It presumably only counts as something bad when President Trump is attacking the media. But the thing that they didn't like is that it didn't feed into their agenda. They've been probably so used to the New York Times headlines actually fitting the left's and the Democrats' agenda on gun control that they were outraged when the first version didn't, and then the New York Times changed it.
But wasn't the first version a fair representation of what the president actually said?
Yes, exactly. And it was absolutely a fair representation. He condemned hatred and racism. And, you know, the Democrats were suggesting that somehow or other this should be interpreted or analyzed in the headline. That was a straightforward news headline, and the context and the analysis should have been as in the actual story, not in the headline.
Hugo Gordon from the Washington Examiner, thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay.
Well, a shocking claim coming from a former Google employee.
When President Trump won in 2016, Google executives went up on stage right away and cried, literally tears streaming down their faces over the fact that President Trump won. They vowed that it would never happen again.
He is claiming the tech giant will try to ramp up the censorship to ensure Donald Trump loses the election. Is it time for Congress to step in? We'll discuss that next.
President Trump has taken a very strong move here, imposing these sweeping sanctions, putting a full block, a full freeze on all assets of all parts of the government of Venezuela. They're all strongly supportive of this new move, and I think there's a renewed sense of confidence here, a renewed determination that we have to see Maduro moved out of power.
That was National Security Advisor John Bolton this morning on the political crisis in Venezuela. The Trump administration imposing a freeze on the Maduro government's assets in the U.S., escalating pressure on Venezuela's disputed president to step down. Blake Berman's live at the White House with the latest on that. Blake, good morning.
Sandra, good morning to you as well. This is a step short of a full-on economic embargo against Venezuela. But as you heard the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, lay out there, these are, as he put it, sweeping sanctions. It definitely ratchets up the sanctions that are currently in place against Venezuela. A couple different components to this one. First off, as you laid out, this freezes the assets of Nicolas Maduro and those underneath him in the Venezuelan government here in the U.S. But this also lets foreigners and foreign entities know that should they do business with Maduro or those underneath him, they could potentially be hit with serious sanctions as well. Here is part of the executive order which lays out the president's thinking and the administration's thinking in all of this. It reads at one point, quote, "In light of the continued usurpation of power by Nicolas Maduro and persons affiliated with him, as well as human rights abuses and ongoing attempts to undermine interim President Juan Guaido and the Venezuelan National Assembly's exercise of legitimate authority in Venezuela." Now, while the focus is on Maduro, this also sends a warning to China and Russia not to engage with Maduro and those who he surrounds himself with. I asked Kellyanne Conway this morning if there was any sort of tipping point that led to the president making this decision at this moment. Watch.
Well, a tipping point is President Maduro, and the president's also warning China and Russia, if you continue to support his regime, that there could be consequences as well. It's no surprise the president has made very clear how he feels about Venezuela and who's the government that we recognize there.
About 45 minutes, maybe an hour from now, the National Security Advisor John Bolton will be speaking in Peru and will lay out the Trump administration's thinking for these additional sanctions. Sandra, keep in mind here, the U.S. hasn't applied this kind of pressure on anyone in the Western Hemisphere in about 30 years. And right now, on a sanctions front, on an economic sanctions front, this puts Venezuela at the same kind of level as Iran, Syria, and North Korea.
Developing situation there. Blake Berman, thank you.
Sandra, the bug is back, or it was, and it was green. I saw it. A trade war between China and the U.S. escalating at this hour after the Dow suffered its biggest drop of the year yesterday. So what happens when markets open minutes from now? There's the green bug right there. I see it. Maria Bartiromo will join us live in studio next to talk about that. Plus,
California now facing a new challenge over its attempt to block President Trump from the ballot there. So how residents are now fighting back.
All we're requiring is people that aspire to be president, it's not about one person, they have to disclose their tax returns.
Session, a bit of a bounce back this morning. The Dow is up 163 points after closing down 760 points yesterday for its worst single day point drop of the year, as the U.S. Treasury Secretary labels China a currency manipulator. And the president calling out Beijing for trying to steal our businesses and factories and hurt our jobs. Maria Bartiromo is the anchor of Mornings with Maria on FBN and Sunday Morning Futures. Fresh off your show this morning, Maria, where I know you were watching the futures all morning long. Here we are, a minute into trading, at least a little bit of a rebound after a big sell-off yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people looked at the sell-off yesterday and said, okay, you know, it is getting to be overdone. I mean, we do have an economy that's growing and doing well. For all intents and purposes, the U.S. calling China a currency manipulator doesn't really have any practical purpose. I mean, it's not like they're going to, you know, hit a switch and all of a sudden something changes. It's just basically telling Beijing, we know what you're doing and we are going to act. And this is not ending anytime soon unless you start protecting the currency and not allow it to fall the way you did. I mean, Beijing said they're going to start selling yuan today and next week in Hong Kong. So if you actually
support their currency.
No, to sell it, to weaken it. They're going to sell the yuan to weaken it. They basically said that. Even though they're saying this is not manipulating our currency, we are holding this currency and we are going to sell some of it.
So I guess I'm sorry, and I was confusing the two things. But then they do have measures to step in then and support the yuan, which they have said that they intend to do. So a lot of it is how much to believe that they tell us they're going to do.
That's
right, Maria?
bingo, spot on. Because the truth is you could say something, but that leads money managers who are in the market to know what you're doing, and they're going to do it. So then, of course, the spigots were open. And it's like the U.S. for years saying, look, we want a strong dollar and not do anything to actually support a strong dollar and just watch it fall. So Beijing is a currency manipulator. It's true. We all knew that. Finally, the U.S. decides, let's make it official. Tell Beijing they're going to have to do something to stop this because, you know, with a cheaper currency, it's making Chinese products that much cheaper. And it's going to basically eliminate the tariff impact for China.
Boost their exports, in other words. So the Dow's responding with this 204-point gain today. The president's been tweeting, China has always used currency manipulation to steal our businesses. This is a president that has shown that he wants to be tough on China. He's followed through with that promise to be tough on China. As far as this currency manipulation claim by the Treasury Department, John Bolton this morning was explaining this does allow certain things to happen, like we can now go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and report it as such. So there are things that can be done.
Yeah, it's sort of like a warning. Look, we're going to do everything you know we can do.
Right.
So for all practical purposes, nothing really changes other than Beijing knows, okay, they may very well take this further.
So there's a lot to take in here because there's the Wall Street Journal this morning. Here's the editorial board. Trade war becomes currency war. So a lot of that uncertainty is what we saw in that sell-off yesterday. But then this morning, another opinion piece. And this was written by former Fed presidents. We know that that Jay Powell, the current Fed president, the president has really been targeting Jay Powell as not doing the right things as the head of the Federal Reserve. America needs an independent Fed. The economy functions best when the central bank is free of short-term political pressures. That piece by former Fed presidents does not name Trump specifically, but you could read into it that they are taking him on and saying this should be an independent body. What did you make of that warning?
They're taking him on. That's exactly. And they're absolutely referring to Donald Trump. They don't want the president to bully around Jay Powell because the country does need an independent Fed. And I agree with that. You don't want the Federal Reserve to feel pressure to make a move in monetary policy because the leader of the free world wants him to. You want them to actually respond to economic conditions. But having said that, let's not forget what went on at the end of last year when Jay Powell was very clear about raising rates 3 times and unwinding the balance sheet. 6 months later to say, oh, we're going to be cutting rates is a clear indication I made a mistake. And I think that's what Jay Powell told the country when he started cutting interest rates. So you can't really blame the president all that for knowing that he made a huge mistake. He was raising rates and now he's cutting rates. Having said that, nobody wants the president to bully Jay Powell because you want to have an independent Federal Reserve. I think all of this worry about the Fed, this worry about Beijing, the currency manipulation, all underlines one more thing, and that is this China fight is not ending anytime soon. The president has been very clear. He's not going to allow China to keep stealing from us unless they actually make it a law in their books in China that it is unlawful to steal intellectual property from the West. I don't know how the president saves face and gets out of this without having substantial change. And Beijing wants to save face and doesn't want it to look like they're responding to Donald Trump.
I've got to leave it there. But do you think that a deal gets put off to post-election?
Yes, I'm not expecting a deal right now because the stakes are way too high. By the way, this sell-off, yeah, there's nervousness. It will sell more. But right now, it looks like yesterday was a bit overdone.
Got it. Maria Bartiromo every weekday morning on FBN. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandra.
All right. We will have much more on this coming up next hour with our headliner. White House Director of Trade Policy Peter Navarro will be joining us live at 10:45 Eastern Time. Stay tuned for that.
There are new developments in the showdown over President Trump's taxes. 4 voters are now suing the state of California after Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill requiring presidential candidates to release 5 years of tax returns to secure a spot on the state's primary ballot. William Lajeunesse is live in Los Angeles with more on this. William.
Well, Rick, to be president, the Constitution requires only 3 things: be 35 or older, born in the U.S., and live here for the last 14 years. But California is now adding one more requirement. The new law says unless President Trump or any other candidate fails to make public 5 years of tax returns, they don't get on the primary ballot in California. Now, former Governor Jerry Brown vetoed the bill, but Governor Gavin Newsom, a proud and perpetual thorn in the president's side, says voters need to see the returns to know if a candidate is prone to corruption.
They have to disclose their tax returns, address issues of self-dealing, conflicts of interest, requiring that regardless of political party. You choose to do the right thing. You could choose not to do the right thing.
But 4 plaintiffs in the conservative group Judicial Watch argue this presents a slippery slope. What's next? Each state requiring medical or mental health records, prescription drugs, what they bought on Amazon, searched on Google, their Facebook friends. Quote, California politicians, in their zeal to attack President Trump, passed a law that also unconstitutionally victimizes California voters, according to group president Tom Fitton. So will the law survive a challenge? Will both sides, scholars say, have decent arguments? States have a right to ensure the integrity of their primary. But years ago, Illinois tried to override the state Democratic Party and dictate the state delegation. Supreme Court said no. Quote, the states themselves have no constitutionally mandated role in the selection of presidential and vice presidential candidates, and allowing each state to enforce their own law could, quote, seriously undercut or indeed destroy the effectiveness of party conventions. So the bottom line, Rick, even if
front of the back, there was a female inside that was at the closest point to the door, and she was in some pain. She said she had some back pain, but the car was smoking. And I just asked her to grab my arm so I could pull her out. So we got her out first, and then the driver ended up jumping out on his own.
Both people inside that vehicle are expected to be okay. It is unclear why the SUV drifted across that road.
Remarkable.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. We must stop the glorification of violence in our society. We must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun.
Calls for action growing stronger following mass shootings in 2 American cities. President Trump urging social media companies to develop tools for spotting early warning signs and identifying potential mass shooters. Tom Dupree is a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under President George W. Bush, and Ted Williams is a former police detective and a Fox News contributor. Let's start with Tom. What about this president's call for the Department of Justice to work with social media companies like 8chan, where the El Paso shooter posted a manifesto before he went on his killing spree?
I think it makes a lot of sense for the government to do whatever it can to identify in advance people who might commit these sorts of horrific acts. We've seen, unfortunately, from history that a lot of times these shooters really either announce their intentions in advance or at least give off a lot of signals that they might be contemplating some sort of atrocity, like what we've seen occur over the last few days. And to the extent that law enforcement, the Justice Department can monitor websites, work with social media companies to basically raise a red flag if they see something troubling like this, I think it's all to the good, and it's an intriguing idea worth pursuing.
So there is software that could help isolate and identify troubling posts and then alert law enforcement.
Yes, you can look at that. There are a number of different techniques that they have developed that basically enable you to analyze people. Obviously, it's not something that you can say with 100% pinpoint accuracy, but again, it's just another tool. It's another data fact that's added to the overall threat assessment mix when you're trying to make these determinations from the perspective of law enforcement.
Senator Lindsey Graham was on special report last night proposing a red flag bill, which would allow police and family members to temporarily restrict access to firearms of people who might pose an imminent threat. Now, 17 states have similar laws. I believe we have a map that shows the states where these types of laws are in effect. Perhaps we don't have it. But Ohio and Texas, there it is. Ohio and Texas are not among those states. And now there's this federal effort. Let's listen to Lindsey Graham real quick.
The government has to prove by clear and convincing evidence that the person is disturbed, a danger to themselves or others. And if that test is met, they can seize the guns and get the person the help they need.
Tom, as a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, your reaction to that?
I think these laws show a lot of promise. As you note, there are a bunch of states that have already enacted them, and it seems to me that oftentimes the first warning sign, the first red flag you would have in a situation like this is from someone close to a potential shooter, either a friend or a family. And it seems to me that if you have someone in that position who has the foresight and the courage to actually raise their hand, raise a red flag, say there may be a situation here, that the legal system needs to be designed in a way to ensure that that cry for help or for assistance or for investigation gets heard and the law enforcement can take appropriate action.
And Ted, as a former law enforcement officer, your reaction to that push for that bill?
Well, I think that it would help. Anything would help at this stage, Rick. But it's like really technically putting a Band-Aid on the problem because there are certain privacy laws, there are HIPAA laws, and there are times where individuals are acting out and their relatives may very well speak about them, and they may be typed, meaning that they are put under a microscope, and that may hurt rather than help, to be candid with you.
Ted, I know you've been closely watching the events down in Texas and in Ohio. The thing that a lot of people are surprised at in Ohio is that the gunman's own sister was one of his first victims. What do you know about that? What are we learning about that?
Well, you know, Rick, that's the $64,000 question. We know just about what the motive was in El Paso, but we do not know what the motive of the shooter was in Ohio. And what we are able to glean from law enforcement is that the shooter, his girlfriend, and his shooter, his sister, and possibly her boyfriend came to the location. They separated. At some stage, the shooter put on some garb, meaning he was dressed in black, had the semi-automatic weapon, and went in and shot up the place and also shot his sister.
Yeah. All right. Ted Williams, Tom Dupree, we're going to leave it there. Thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
This just in, we are now learning Nobel laureate and author Toni Morrison has died. Morrison was lauded for her examination of the female experience within the Black community. Her critically acclaimed novel, Beloved, won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. She received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993 and was awarded our nation's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Her publisher saying this morning, quote, "We are profoundly sad to report that Toni Morrison has died at the age of 88. We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language. That may be the measure of our life."
For the fact that President Trump won, they vowed that it would never happen again, and they want to use all of the power and all the resources that they have to control the flow of information to the public and make sure that Trump loses in 2020.
A former Google employee speaking out, accusing the search engine giant of having a political agenda and saying the company wants the president to lose the election next year. Here to discuss it, Carly Shimkus, host of Fox News Headlines 24/7 on Fox News Radio. A very strong warning coming from this former Google employee,
Yes.
Carly.
And we have to be very clear because he is making very serious allegations against Google. This is one man's opinion, and he was fired from the company. But he says that Google is doing everything in their power to make sure that President Trump doesn't win in 2020. And he says that they could do things like tweak search results or censor political ads. He also says that they could make psychological profiles on people to change their minds. So if you look up a conservative video, they could show you something that could counter that point. Now, just because they can do these things does not mean that they are. And Google has repeatedly said that they don't have a bias against conservatives. Whether you believe that or not usually depends on what side of the aisle you sit on. And Google released a statement in response. I think we have that. I want to read it right now. They say, "We enforce our workplace policies without regard to political viewpoints. Lively debate is a hallmark of Google's workplace culture. Harassment, discrimination, and the unauthorized access and theft of confidential company information is not." They are talking about why he was fired, although this former Google engineer, Kevin Cernacki, says that he wasn't fired because he stole any company information. He was fired because he's a conservative.
Because that's what the company says. He describes himself as a whistleblower.
Yes.
He maintains that he was terminated because of his outspoken conservative views. He had this message for the president heading into 2020.
Yeah.
I think President Trump needs to know that there are a lot of potential whistleblowers in these companies, and they will speak up if they know that he has their back.
He says that there is bias at every level of that organization.
Yeah, you know, I don't know if the company is doing something as serious as building psychological profiles to literally change the outcome of the election. But it is clear that a majority of Google employees and executives do lean left. 95% of donations went to Democrats in the 2018 midterm elections. Internal documents show that Google employees discussed ways to tweak search results after the president came out with his travel ban. And then there was this leaked video of executives literally crying at a company-wide meeting after President Trump won. So all of that stuff is very concerning.
And he's not just claiming it's happening at Google. He's saying it's just happening at large social media companies elsewhere, but others are better keeping it under control, were his words.
So the next question, should social media companies be regulated?
We'll see.
For another time.
Carly, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Rick?
Democrats facing new controversy as they continue to slam the president ahead of his trip to visit the communities of El Paso